So how does the Smartcut actually work? It's not rocket science by any measure, but it's also not completely intuitive. Let's get into it. Before we talk about how the Smartcut actually helps you measure and cut boards, we need to discuss a few of the key features of a miter saw setup with the Smartcut. Let's walk through it. You can see we have a top-down view of a miter saw with a Smartcut attached. In this case, we have the miter saw, which you see here in black with its blade down. Next, we have a Smartcut tape measure holster. And that job of the tape measure holster is basically to hold your own tape measure in the Smartcut. Next to it, also on the tape measure holster, is your gauge spring. And your gauge spring is going to tell you where you're going to cut your board. The other piece that we have is called the tape end plate. The tape end plate, which is fastened to your rabbet, is going to hold the edge of your tape. And it actually is adjustable, which is a very important piece of what we're going to describe in the next couple seconds here. You'll have a Smartcut rail, and those rails in many cases will go out to 9 feet to allow you to measure an 8-foot board, 13 feet to measure a 12-foot board, or potentially beyond, depending on what you need. We have a Smartcut rabbet, and the Smartcut rabbet's job is basically to ride on that rail and move the edge of that tape left or right as you're trying to find the measurement where you need to cut the board. Here we have your initial gauge board. Your initial gauge board can really be any piece of scrap that generally is a little larger than your deck plate on the miter saw. In this case, we like to get it pretty close to 16 inches, although it doesn't have to be perfect. In this case, let's assume that we know this gauge board is exactly 16 inches. When we initially set up the Smartcut, it is very likely that your gauge spring is not going to be measuring at 16 inches, which means if you were to cut boards, they would be inaccurate. In this case, we see that the gauge board of 16 inches actually is providing a measurement of 12 inches and 3/4, which doesn't line up to 16. In order for us to align your tape measure to read 16 inches, we will have to adjust this. As you can see, 12 3/4 is not going to cut it. So what do we do? In order to measure any future board accurately, we have to first measure our gauge board accurately. In order to do this, we will slide our tape end plate left or right to ensure our gauge spring measures 16 inches. In this case, we simply slide the tape end plate left. Once we're done with movement of your tape end plate, which we have right here, which slides left or right, we now have to lock that tape in place because it is accurately measuring 16 inches as read on your gauge spring to the board that you're going to cut. And there we have 16 inches. After that is accomplished, we will tighten the top set screw with a pair of pliers or wrench. It is important that the top set screw is tight. We don't want that tape end plate to move, theoretically, ever, if this is the miter saw setup that you'll have for all future work. We also have a bottom set screw that we use, which is nylon, and the purpose of that set screw below the top set is simply to ensure that the tape measure doesn't flop around and stays relatively horizontal. Once you do that, you can remove your 16 gauge board and cut freely. In this case, if we needed to cut a board at 39 inches after setting the gauge, we would slide the board left from the rabbet until we read 39 inches at the gauge spring and then pull down the miter saw. And that's all there is to it. From here on out, because you've set the Smartcut exactly where you need to cut, you'll be able to measure and cut any board thereafter without the use of your pencil or without the use of your tape measure.